What's up, everyone? Hope you've been enjoying the Pan Am Intercollegiate review series. And this is the third and final part of the tournament, featuring the last two games that I played, rounds 7 and 8, because I sat out round 9. But these two games on the last day were two of the most interesting games, if I do say so myself. And in the first game, we were actually up against Georgia Tech again, but this time their A team. We dispatched their B team, but now we were on to their A team, who had an average rating just under 2,200. Similarly to our round 5 opponents, this is going to be a very tough test. And the funny thing about this game is the night before I found out the pairing, and I saw that they had an NM on board too. I started prepping for him, and I spent about an hour reviewing a certain line in the English opening that I was planning to play, only to find out the morning of that I was actually going to be playing against a different NM because they also had a rotation of 5, meaning they kind of switched out. So all that prep went out the window, and now I was facing a guy who played the French defense, which is something that I wasn't going to be afraid of facing because I played it before, and relatively speaking, the positions I get are pretty good. But let's see how I do against this national master. So e4, e6, all standard stuff. Of course, he plays the French, and this is all theory. We played it very quickly. This is called the classical Steinitz-Boleslavsky variation. And now he takes and plays bishop c5. Queen d2, preparing the long castle. He castles, I castle, and he plays a6. So this is 10 moves in now, and none of us thought more than like 3 seconds on any move because this is all theory. We've known it. And especially him, I mean, he's probably played this like hundreds of times. He's super comfortable here. Me, I mean, I've played it a decent number of times, but as we get deeper, it becomes a little bit trickier. I have to be very precise against someone who knows what they're doing. And here, I kind of decided I was going to follow my typical game plan. And after thinking for a few minutes, I played h4. And the idea of this move is to get kingside play going as soon as possible because this is a very dynamic position. Black is going to go for stuff like b5 and potentially queen a5 and try to attack here. I need to attack on the opposite side and play maybe rook h3 and rook g3 and try to put pressure on the g file. But there are different ways to go about this. Another way is to sometimes play queen f2 and then bring the queen in. But I decided to just stick with the plan that's something that I've employed in the past and seems to work. So here we go, h4. And he decides here now to take, which kind of threw me off because why is he taking with the bishop? Typically, if people take, they take with the knight because shouldn't you just preserve your bishop? But it turns out bishop takes is also a pretty viable option because now, after I take, my bishop is kind of stuck here. I mean, it doesn't have a great site, and actually, in these positions, a plan sometimes for white is actually to play f5 and sort of sacrifice to open up this diagonal. But here it's not so easy because he's going to be able to take my bishop at any time, basically whenever he wants to. And also, what I started to realize is now after he played b5 is that he might be preparing some kind of maneuver where he puts his knight on b6 and then brings it to c4. Maneuvering the knights in this opening from Black's perspective is kind of the key. If the Black can get his knights somewhere out into the center, it's going to make it very difficult for me. And in this position, I was already kind of feeling a bit uncomfortable, not in familiar territory, and I spent a whole 8 minutes out of the 25 thinking on what I should do, and I decided to just play rook h3, kind of just continue with the plan. I decided not even to save my bishop, which in hindsight was probably dumb. I should have just brought the bishop back to g1 or to f2 and preserved it, and this makes it a little bit harder for him because at least now I'm always going to have the bishop on this diagonal. If he attacks me here, I can just put my knight over here, and my knight and my bishop control this square. So if he ever just plays queen a5, I can just go b3, and it's actually pretty difficult for him to dislodge my knight to really kind of break through with his queen. But I thought that saving the bishop would be kind of a waste of tempo. I decided to just go for the attack. But he was also looking to attack, and he played b4 here. And again, I was faced with the choice of where to move my knight. Obviously, I can move it to a4 or e2, don't really want to go back to b1. That's too passive. But I decided to move it to e2, where it could be a little bit more flexible than committing it to a4. And here he just played a5. I mean, very simply, he just continuing with his plan of trying to push his pawns and break my queen side where my king is castled. So I played king b1 to just get my king to a little bit safer position. And he played bishop a6, developing his last piece. And here, again, I played a little bit too passively. What I probably should have done was try to really go for some rook g3 ideas and maybe try to attack. I played knight c1 with the idea to trade these bishops and potentially maneuver my knight to a better spot. He just played queen c7, and after a trade of bishops, now I brought my knight back, thinking that, okay, if he takes, then I will take, and my knight will be nice and centralized. He can try to go knight c5 to come to e4, but then I'll be faster with knight to b5, and then I'll get my knight to d6 and actually stop him. But he didn't do that. He just played rook c8. Now he's lining his rook and queen up against his c2 pawn, starting to build pressure here. I played rook g3. I'm kind of scrambling to get my own attack going, seeing as how his is materializing a lot faster. And now he took, I took, and again, if he plays knight c5 here, then I can play knight b5, but he just made a very smart, patient move, rook b6. Now he's stopping me from invading with my knight, and I can't really stop him from doing that with his, because if I go to here, he'll just kick my knight. So I played queen e2, trying to get my queen to the king side to really attack him. I mean, he doesn't have any defenders, so maybe I can do something to crack his king side. He simply played knight c5, and I played queen g4, right? Obviously threatening checkmate. Only one way to defend it. He plays g6. I play h5. And now he played knight e4, attacking my rook, but I was prepared, I took. And now he had to be super precise. He has three choices. Obviously, he can take the rook, and he can take this pawn two ways, but which is the only one that's good? Well, if he takes the rook, that would be not so smart, because then I take here with a double check now, and he actually has to go king h8. This is the only move that would allow him to survive. And then I would take the knight, and even though he'd be up the exchange, his king is a little bit weak, obviously in the corner with no pawns to protect it. But the reason that he has to do this is because if he takes here, then I actually take the knight, and there's actually no way for him to stop this checkmate. It's simply checkmate next move, no matter what he does. Well, unless he sacrifices his queen, of course, but then my knight just takes. And if he were to go here, obviously then I promote to a queen, and I don't have to go farther to show that this is winning. So that's what happens if he took the rook, which was possible but dangerous. But actually, if he took with this pawn, it would be even worse, because now I play rook h3, allowing this fork, because then I have actually a stunning move here. One that I didn't see in the game. In the game, I thought that I could just play queen h4, which is still pretty good, but there's actually a really nice move here, rook d to h1. Hanging the queen, but it can't be taken because now there's check and checkmate. Pawn is the hero here regarding the f6 square. So black would have to now take the rook, but then after I take, again, I have a battery lined up here, and black actually has no good defense. He can run, but he can't hide, and eventually his king gets hunted down and it's mate. So that didn't work, obviously, and he saw that when he calculated, but he found the best move, and that is f takes g6, and now I hit a wall, because even though I have my queen and my rook kind of on the king side, my rook is still under attack, and he is now building up his own attack, and what do? I played rook f3, dodging this fork here, because if I put my rook on h3, then there's this, and look at that, all three pieces are forked. But after this move, he now really started to attack and played a4. And now I realized that I was in huge trouble. I mean, he is one move away from coming here and just completely cracking my king side. I kind of desperately played f5, trying to get some counterplay, but this was just a total bluff, and he called it, he took, and I was planning to take with the knight, but then I realized I couldn't, because that would just allow a simple checkmate in two moves. So I took with the rook instead. But now here comes his attack. He plays b3. And the point is, he's trying to break my king's protection, obviously. And I took with this pawn, because if I take with this pawn, again now it's a forced checkmate for black. Knight to d2 check. And this is a savage move, deflecting my rook and kind of taking advantage of my weak back rank. Obviously, if I take, there's this checkmate, and if I go in the corner, well, it's the same thing. This is mate. So I couldn't take with that pawn. I took with other pawn, and after takes, I played c3, thinking that I was at least safe for the time being. But actually I wasn't. In this position, black is completely, and I mean completely, winning. He just needs to find one move, basically, to put me away. But in this position, my opponent went into a long think and played a flashy move that was not necessarily correct. So let me actually flip it to this perspective and see if you can find the winning idea here for black. There's a lot of tempting moves, but which one is best? Well, if you thought that the move is knight takes c3, sacking the knight to just completely bust the king side, that is actually what my opponent did, but it's not so simple. The move that actually wins here quite simply is the move queen to a7. It's kind of a silent move, but completely deadly because it's simply threatening queen a2 check, and after king moves, queen a1 mate. And how do you defend it? Really, white can't. I mean, white can sack some pieces on the king side, white can sack the knight here, but after something like rook takes, I mean, white is just completely busted. Even I think now knight takes c3 is more powerful, because then if takes, then check, and after here, there's this, and then this takes, and the king is completely busted. I mean, probably even just rook takes here, and then this is actually checkmate. So that would have been game over. I mean, instantly, I think if, and I saw this actually during the game, I saw that if he just brings his queen and maybe his rook over this way, I'm just dead lost. And I think I would have resigned had he done that. But luckily for me, he was fixated on this sacrifice and played it. But after takes and queen takes, it looks pretty good for black, but it's not so simple. But it's also not so simple to defend. And I had not a lot of time. I had maybe 3 minutes left, and I did not find the best defensive move. I played rook f2. What I should have played was the move rook f3, which I considered, but there was one key idea that I had to see for this to work. Basically, the idea for black here is the stunning sacrifice queen c2 check. And the idea is if knight takes, pawn takes, now if my king goes this way, then check, and he promotes to the queen. And with my rook on f3, I can't take. And the king is getting checkmated. But what I needed to have seen is that in this position, I can actually send my king this way, which I didn't consider at the time. And now, if he takes here, then actually I take, and I'm checkmating him because here, and this is mate. So he doesn't have time to take. He would have to then check this way, and then I get to block. And now, the only way for black to actually not lose is to go here and threaten a check this way. And then I would then have to repeat, and this is basically a draw now, with rook blocking again, and we just shuffle. Because if he does anything like take, then I will simply take back, and I have more material. If he tries to check this way, then my king actually escapes going forward, and a super messy position, but actually white survives. Unfortunately, though, I did not see that critical king a2 move, and instead I played rook f2, which is a little bit different here because now the queen is not under attack, and I don't have the rook a3 move blocking in a later position. So now queen c2 actually works, but there was even a better move here for black, which, again, he didn't find, and that was, again, the idea to go rook a8 and bring his rook over this way. And if I block, then actually he has another stunning move, rook a2. Just completely zeroing in on my rook, and I don't have enough of a defense. I mean, I can bring my queen back, but then he will go back here, and look at this. He's just trying to checkmate me. I can't do anything about it. I can sack the knight, but then takes, and he takes my queen. So this is all totally savage stuff that honestly would have taken him a lot more time to calculate, but we're playing a rapid game here, and we have about a couple minutes left each at this point, so understandably, neither of us were totally precise, and so eventually he played this move, queen c2 check, takes, check, promote to the queen, but now I take, takes, and king takes. So after that whole exchange, somehow I survive into a position where I'm down a pawn, but still it should be probably winning for black. He plays here, I defend, and we both have about a minute left at this point. I spent a lot of time throughout that game trying to just figure out what to do, and he spent like a lot of time calculating how to put me away, but didn't quite find the way to do it. But he's banking on the fact that he can win this rook endgame. And so he brings his king in, and at this point I'm just kind of stuck. I mean, I can't really move my rook because then I lose the pawn, and with 1 against 3 it's just hopeless. Can't really move my king too far either because then he's going to bring his king in and then bring his rook and try to win the pawn. So I ended up just kind of shuffling back and forth here for a few moves, and then eventually I realized that I have to do something. I played rook e1. And the idea was I was trying to get my rook over here to attack the pawn. So for example, if he played h4, I wanted to go rook h1. But it wouldn't really work because he would take, and I would take, and then he would just bring his king in. And even if I take this pawn, he would then take my pawn, and this is a completely winning rook endgame. I mean, it requires a little bit of technique, but my king and rook aren't close enough to stop his pawn. But luckily for me in this position, my opponent had like 30 seconds, and he made a huge mistake. He played rook e4, which allows me to trade rooks and then go king here, and suddenly I'm defending my pawn and close to his pawn. So he played here, I took, and he took. And now I played g3, just making sure that he can't advance. And believe it or not, this is actually a theoretically drawn endgame. Even though I'm down a pawn, there shouldn't be a way for him to win this with precise play from both of us. But, as I mentioned, we were both super low on time here. And here he played king f5, and now it's my move, and I have only one move that doesn't lose. See if you can find it. And that move here in this position is actually king back to f2. Which I had considered and thought that it was losing because he brings his king in and it looks like I'm just going to be trapped in the corner. But actually here I play king e2, and now I have the opposition, which means that he can't advance. If he goes this way, I just go this way and I stay in front of him. If he goes back, then I go here. And eventually we meet again. And if he ever tries to trade pawns, well then I'm in front of his pawn. There's no way he can win this. But in the time trouble, I thought that king f2 was losing, but in reality, I made the losing move and played king d4, which in hindsight is just such a dumb move because it brings my king away from the pawns, and this allows him to play king here. And now he trades the pawns, and in this position, I actually resigned because I realized I was totally lost. Instead of being in front of the pawn, my king is now on the side, and there's no way I can get here to stop it. If I go here, he just goes here, and eventually he's going to keep his king here, and now there's no way for me to cut him off. He's just going to push the pawn, queen, and the rest is simple. So that was a very tough loss. I mean, I did everything in my power to defend. My opponent could have put me away, but didn't. But then I blundered in the king and pawn endgame with little time, but still something I should have known. And we lost that round. Actually got swept 4-0 by the Georgia Tech A team, very strong team. And I went to 1-5 on the tournament. Next game would be my last. So for round 8, having been kicked down after losing, we were now up against Oberlin College. Not exactly a chess powerhouse. They had an average rating of somewhere between 14 and 1500. And I had a 1500 opponent who, despite my obvious rating advantage, I was not about to underestimate, having lost a lot of games in this tournament. I opened with e4, he played c6, the Caro-Kann, and I went for f3, the fantasy variation, which I so enjoy. And this throws a lot of Caro-Kann players off if they haven't seen this before, because the more common moves here are knight c3, e takes d, and e5, but I go for f3, and he now took and played knight f6, which is not a very good move in this position. Really, the only good move in this position for black is e5, kind of a sacrifice that white does not want to take. They play knight f3, but not going to go too much into theory. Knight f6 is not such a good move. I played e5, and he played knight d5. And already here, white has a pretty nice advantage, but I had actually faced this like earlier in a blitz game, and I had played the move knight f3, and then my opponent played bishop g4, and I really didn't like that pin. Even though white is still like significantly better, it was just kind of annoying. So in this position, I thought for a while, and I wanted to find some way where I could really optimize my attack. After all, the fantasy variation, it's all about attacking. So what did I do? Well, the move I should have played, probably the best in this position, is c4. Kicking the knight back, and then following it up with knight c3. And even though white's center is very advanced, it can't really be targeted easily, because if black ever plays something like c5, white can just push past and go d5. And these pawns become super dangerous. They're like a wave about to crush black. But I didn't realize this at the time, and so I thought for a few minutes and played the ambitious novelty queen f3. My idea was that I would then develop my bishop, develop my knight, castle, and put a lot of pressure along the f-file. And I was also stopping bishop g4, so looks like a great move, right? Well, actually, this move has never been played in this position, and there's very good reason. It's actually a very serious mistake. And the reason for that is when the queen moves away from d1, it has now vacated its two roles, which is protecting c2 and protecting d4. And that can be exposed by the move knight to b4, which I realized was possible as soon as I played queen f3 and had to sit there for like 2 minutes just hoping that my opponent wouldn't see it. And luckily he didn't, because if he had played this, I would be in huge trouble. In this position, the knight threatens to take here with a fork, and also my pawn is hanging. I obviously can't protect both. I mean, c3 allows this and this. I would have to play something like bishop d3, protecting the pawn, but then he takes here, and then this pawn is falling, and that would just be a disastrous start to the opening. Luckily for me, my opponent didn't see it, simply played e6, allowing me to defend with c3. And we simply developed, traded bishops. I played here just to stop any knight before ideas. We traded. He played rook c8 here, and I played knight c3. He played bishop e7, and we both castled. And now, I mean, I got a decent development, but can't really say I got much of an advantage out of the opening as I could have, because now his pieces are pretty nicely developed. I mean, he's putting some pressure against my kind of backwards d4 pawn, and I have to do something quickly to attack, otherwise my center is just going to be under heavy fire. So I thought for a while and played queen g3, setting up a threat of bishop h6, which he defended against by playing this, so that he can play rook f7 and defend against the checkmate. So now I developed my rook. He got his king out of the pin. I brought my bishop back, and he played rook f8. And now I played knight e4 to try to get my knight kind of more in the game. And he took. I traded a pair of rooks, and now took. And now he played queen c7, attacking my pawn here. Obviously, not a lot of ways to defend it, so I played the move knight to d6. And he didn't have to take. He actually could have just gone back with rook f8, but he took, allowing me to now get a passed pawn on d6. Kind of a weird spot because it's kind of can't be defended by the rook just yet because the knight's in the way, but potentially this is a very nice asset. He moved his queen back, which was just unnecessarily passive, and now I decided to trade the knights so that I could really be able to support this pawn maximally. He gave a check here and won my pawn. But perhaps he should have been a little bit more worried about this pawn reaching d8, because the more it's pushed, the more it kind of gains in value. And my opponent had to jump in front with knight d8 to stop it. And now I was already feeling like I was in kind of a puzzle rush moment. I felt like I was on the verge of victory because my pawn is close to queening. I have a queen and a bishop that are ready to get active. I just need to find the most precise way to continue, which is tough when you have only a couple minutes left. And here I played queen h4, which is a good move. Another move would have been to play something like queen b8 here, which just puts pressure on the knight, forces the queen back, and then I could just take this pawn and then attack the knight, and eventually, after I just make some room for my king, black can't really do much, I'm going to eventually kind of bring my rook in and probably win a piece. But I didn't do that. Instead, I played here, and he moved his rook back. Should mention that if he plays queen g5, I play bishop g5, and then I'm going to pick up the knight. So he can't go there. Instead, he brought his rook back, and I played bishop d4 here, attacking his queen, which objectively wasn't the most precise move, but already I had an idea of targeting his g7 pawn. Because his rook moved back, I knew that with the dark squares, could be a little bit weak in his position. He played queen b3 here, attacking my rook. I slid the rook over. I should mention that at this point, we both had like under a minute. He had maybe like 20 seconds. I had maybe 45 seconds or whatever. Actually, I think that one of these moves I made with 5 seconds on the clock. So we were very low and had to move very quickly. And here he played queen d3. I moved the bishop to attack the rook. He went to g8. And I went in with my queen. He went to here. I moved the rook. And he played queen c2, attacking my bishop. I moved my bishop to d4, setting up a dangerous threat, which with like 10 seconds on the clock, unfortunately for him, he failed to recognize and played the move queen to d3, which attacks the bishop, but allows me to finish the game with a very nice combination. I'm going to give you a chance to see if you can find it. It's the move queen takes g7. And after rook takes, which is forced, rook to f8, checkmate. So that was a nice mate in 2 to finish the game. Far from the best game for me, especially against the 1500. I could have completely embarrassed myself out of the opening with that dubious novelty that was just basically a blunder. But luckily, I was able to kind of get into a decent position and navigate this kind of sharp endgame better than he did and win the game. And that was the end of my tournament personally. I finished with 2 wins and 5 losses out of 7 games. The team then, after this round, which we won, went on to face a tough opponent in the last game. The last match, I should say. I forget who exactly we faced, but despite our boards 2 and 3 losing, our boards 1 and 4 were actually able to come back and win, meaning we drew the match 2-2 and finished with a score of 4.5 out of 9, and finished the tournament in 33rd place, which I believe is where we actually ranked going in, so we met expectations. I mean, 4.5 out of 9 for a team with an average rating of 2,000 is not a bad result, considering there's plenty of teams with like average ratings of 22, 23, up to 2,700. So yeah, this was an interesting tournament. Personally, not a great tournament for me, but I learned a lot from these losses. A lot of good experiences playing against strong players, so I can't really complain. And I hope you enjoyed all these tournament reviews. And the next tournament I will be reviewing will be a tournament that I did a lot better in, the Charlotte Open. So stay tuned for that.